the shadow, and the stillness. The shadow came before the sound. That was the thing people would remember later, when they sat around fires and tried to explain it to those who had not been there. Not the wing beats, not the displaced wind that rattled every shutter on the high street, not the deep resonant groan of something enormous laboring through the sky. The shadow arrived first, vast and wrong against the pale Tuesday morning, sliding over the market square like a stain, swallowing the clean autumn light in a single slow breath. Ashenvale had not seen a dragon in 3 generations. The village carried the idea of dragons the way most quiet places carry the idea of catastrophe, as something that happened elsewhere to other people, and in stories told to explain why you should be careful and grateful and never assume that peace is permanent. There were old carvings above the mill door. There was a faded mural on the inner wall of the church showing something winged and enormous being driven back into distant mountains. Children grew up knowing dragons existed the way they knew the ocean existed, as a fact that had no real texture yet, no smell, no weight. The weight arrived on a Tuesday. It arrived with a sound like sails in a gale, like the whole sky clearing its throat, and every person in the market square looked up at the same moment and received the same information at the same instant. This was real. This was now, and every instinct that had ever kept any ancestor alive was screaming the same single syllable. Run. They ran. Baskets hit the cobblestones. Of vegetables rolled into gutters. A cart overturned. Mothers grabbed children by the wrists without looking at them, moving on pure animal certainty toward doors, toward alleys, toward the thick oak beams of the inn and the heavy stone of the mill and anything that felt like it could stand between a soft human body and whatever was descending from the sky. Every soul in the square ran, the weight of ancient things. It had been magnificent once. That much was still visible. The way ruins are still visible. The way you can look at a collapsed wall and understand from the remaining stones how tall and certain it had been before time made its opinion known. The dragon's wingspan, even folded and ragged at the edges, swallowed the width of the square. Its body, when it finally settled to the ground, displaced the air around it like a falling building, sending a warm pressure outward that rattled the ensign and lifted dust from the cobblestones in slow, spinning columns. But the scales that should have caught the morning light and thrown it back in deep greens or blues or the rich bronze of old coins were ash-colored instead, pale and flaking at the edges like parchment left too near a fire for too many years. One of its great curved horns had broken off somewhere in the long machinery of its life, leaving a pale stub that had calcified without ever properly healing, a wound so old it had become simply a feature. Its wings, folding now against its body, with the slow deliberateness of something performing a familiar action that had grown difficult, showed tears along the membrane, old tears, healed to thin, translucent scars that caught the light differently than the rest. It was exhausted in a way that went past the body, past muscle and bone and the enormous effort of flight. It was exhausted in the way of something that had been carrying a specific weight for a very long time, and had traveled a very long distance, and had arrived at last at the only place the weight could be set down. It landed less like a predator and more like a mountain deciding finally to sit. The impact shook the cobblestones. A loose shutter banged open on the upper floor of the inn. Somewhere behind a barrel, someone made a small, involuntary sound of terror. Then the silence settled. The dragon's head lowered, slow and deliberate, and its eyes opy. What thunder remembers. Every person hiding in Ashenvale that morning made the same calculation. It was not a conscious calculation. It happened somewhere below thought, in the older architecture of the mind, the part built long before language or reason, or the ability to talk yourself out of being afraid. It happened in the half-second between the dragon's chest expanding and its mouth beginning to open, and what it produced was not a decision so much as a certainty, unanimous and absolute across every hiding soul in every doorway and behind every barrel and pressed flat against every cold stone wall. This was the end of it. Fire was coming. The kind of fire that did not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, between the brave and the hidden, between the person who had lived a full life and the child clutching her mother's skirt behind the mill door. The kind of fire that rewrote the landscape and left only the question of what had stood here before. Hands gripped hands, eyes squeezed shut. Prayers were begun that their owners were not certain they believed in, but offered anyway, the way people do when the alternatives have run out. The dragon's mouth opened, and what came out was a name. It arrived the way weather arrives, not from a single direction, but from everywhere at once, filling the square the way water fills a low place, finding every corner and crevice and the space between heartbeats. It was long, the name, built from syllables that seemed to belong to no language currently spoken in any hall or market or house of learning on the continent. It was layered in the way that very old things are layered, the way stone is layered, carrying in its strata the record of everything that pressed down upon it across uncountable years. It was older than the kingdom, older than the church whose bell had not yet dared to ring. Older than the road that ran through Ashen Vale, older than the reason the road had been built, older than the the walk across the square. He moved without drama. That was the thing that the blacksmith, watching through a gap in the inn door, would never quite be able to explain to anyone afterward. Not the fact that Corwin walked toward the dragon, though that alone was extraordinary enough to occupy a lifetime of retelling. It was the way he walked, the complete and total absence of performance in it. He set the half-carved sparrow down on the workshop step with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who intended to pick it up again later, placing it where it would not roll, positioning it with the same small, unconscious care he gave every piece of wood that passed through his hands. He wiped his palms on his apron, both hands, thoroughly, the way you wipe your hands when you want them clean and present for whatever comes next. And then he stepped off the workshop step and walked into the square. He did not run. He did not creep. He did not adopt the careful sideways posture of a man trying to appear smaller than he was, or the rigid, overcorrected spine of someone performing bravery for an audience. He walked the way he always walked, slightly unhurried, slightly inward, the walk of a man whose mind was already where his body was going and had simply sent his feet along to catch up. The square was a quiet disaster around him, scattered cabbages and overturned baskets and a broken clay pot still rocking slightly on the cobblestones, a child's dropped toy near the well, the small frozen wreckage of an ordinary morning interrupted. Corwin moved through it without looking down, stepping around what needed to be stepped around, his eyes fixed ahead with a steadiness that the miller's wife, watching through her shutter crack, would later describe as the most frightening and the most comforting thing she had ever seen simultaneously. He stopped 10 feet from the dragon's nose. The scarred, enormous, ash-scaled face of a creature 8 centuries old was close. The knot and the question. The change moved through the dragon like weather moving through a valley. It began somewhere deep, deeper than scale or muscle, or the great laboring architecture of bone that had carried this creature across 8 centuries and whatever impossible distance it had crossed to arrive here. It began in the place where exhaustion lives, when it has been carried long enough to become something else entirely, something closer to vigil than to tiredness. The specific tension of a creature that has kept itself alive through sheer sustained intention, and nothing else for longer than it should have been possible. When Corwin spoke the name, that tension released. Not violently. Not with the dramatic shudder of something breaking. It released the way a knot releases when the right amount of careful pressure is applied in exactly the correct direction. A single moment of resistance, and then a giving way so complete and so quiet that the absence of the tension was almost louder than the tension itself had been. The dragon's amber eyes half closed. Its breath changed rhythm, deepening, slowing, losing the controlled, careful quality of breath that is being rationed and managed and made to last. Something vast and held settled downward through its body like water, finally finding the level it had always been seeking. It was, unmistakably, relief. Behind the heavy oak door of the inn, pressed together in the particular uncomfortable intimacy of people who have been frightened into the same small space, the blacksmith had been watching through the gap with an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from terror toward something it did not yet have a name for. He watched Corwin stop. He watched Corwin speak. He watched what happened in the dragon's enormous face afterward. He turned to the people pressed around him. "How does he know its name?" he hissed, low and urgent, to anyone who might have an answer. The silence he received, the man who waited 61 years old, and Ashen Vale had shaped most of them. He had been born in the house 2 doors down from the workshop he now owned, delivered by the same midwife who had delivered half the village in her long tenure, in the same upstairs room where his mother had been born before him. He had learned to walk on the cobblestones of the high street. He had learned to read in the church schoolroom. He had grown up with the smell of the river in spring and the specific quality of light that fell across the valley in October, the kind of light that made everything look briefly like a painting of itself, more vivid and more final than usual, as if the world were noting its own beauty before the gray came in. He had come back to those cobblestones after 11 years away and had never left again. He had married. I came out of the workshop on the corner were known in villages 3 days' travel in every direction as something worth seeking out. They were beautiful, the toys. That was never in question. But they were also, in ways that people felt more than they could articulate, slightly unsettling. The wooden animals had joints that moved with a smoothness that seemed to belong to something studied rather than something guessed at, as if the maker had spent considerable time understanding exactly how a living creature moved before rendering it in miniature. The carved figures had expressions too specific for toys, emotions too precise and too adult, as the face of a wooden soldier wearing something that looked uncomfortably like genuine weariness. The music boxes played melodies that no one could identify or later remember clearly, only that they had heard them somewhere before in the way you feel you have been somewhere before without being able to. The language before names. There are languages that carry history in their bones. The common tongue of the continent was practical and adaptable, and had absorbed over its centuries of use the vocabulary of trade and war and governance and religion, bending itself to accommodate new things as new things arrived, which is the mark of a language built for survival rather than precision. It was good for negotiation. It was good for argument. It was good for the 1,000 daily transactions of human life, the buying and selling, the promising and accusing, the explaining and the asking, and the careful navigation of other people's feelings. It was not built to hold what Vatharindal needed to say. The dragon had spoken it once, in the middle centuries of his life, and when humans had been newer to the mountain ranges and the early conversations between species had required a common ground. He had learned it the way a musician learns an instrument that is not their primary one, competently, functionally, but always aware of the gap between what the instrument could produce and what the music actually required. Every time he had spoken the common tongue, he had felt the shape of his thoughts changing to fit the available words, contracting in some places and flattening in others, and what arrived at the listener was always an approximation. He had abandoned it 4 centuries ago without regret. The old language was different in the way that bedrock is different from topsoil. It had not evolved to accommodate anything because it had been present before there was anything new to accommodate. It predated kingdoms and the borders that kingdoms draw. It predated the religions that named the mountains and the rivers and the moral weight of human choices. It existed from the era when the world was still in the early process of deciding what it was, and the creatures moving across it were still in the early process of deciding what they were, and the language that the vigil in the square. From the outside, it looked like a conversation between old friends. That was the disorienting thing, the thing that slowly, over the course of the first hour, began pulling people out from behind their doors and barrels and shuttered windows by the sheer gravitational pull of its ordinariness. They had braced for catastrophe. They had received instead something that looked, from a careful distance, remarkably like two beings who had not seen each other in a long time, sitting down together and taking the time that the reunion deserved. Corwin had folded himself cross-legged onto the cobblestones, with the practical ease of a man unconcerned with appearances, his apron spread across his knees, his posture neither rigid with fear nor performing any particular kind of calm. He simply sat the way people sit when they are genuinely present in a moment and not managing it from a distance. He sat the way you sit with someone who is telling you something important and you know that your only task is to receive it completely. The dragon's great head had come down to the ground somewhere in the first exchange of words, not a collapse, but a lowering, a deliberate and exhausted settling, the way a very tired person finally allows a pillow to take the weight they have been holding in their own neck for too long. The amber eyes were half-lidded, present, but no longer carrying the effort of full alertness. The enormous chest rose and fell with the slow, labored rhythm of old bellows working past their reasonable lifespan, each breath a considered undertaking, each exhale carrying a warmth that drifted across the cobblestones and made the air near the dragon smell of wood smoke and high altitude and pine forests at the edge of the snow line. The voices continued, low, continuous, unhurried, rising and falling in the old language like weather over open ground. The crowd watched. They watched the way people watch things they cannot fully see, the weight of a name. It took the whole afternoon to say. Not because the telling was complicated, though it was, but because Vathorindal had not spoken at length to another living creature in a very long time, and the words came out the way water comes out of a spring that has been still through a long, dry season, slowly at first, tentatively, as if testing whether the channel still worked, and then with increasing steadiness as the old rhythm returned and the language remembered what it was for. Corwin listened without interrupting, without the small, anxious interjections that humans use to prove they are following, the nods and affirmations and brief verbal punctuation that fill the silences in ordinary conversation. He simply listened with the whole of his attention, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than most people understand, and the dragon spoke into that attention the way a musician plays to an audience that has gone genuinely quiet, with more care and more honesty than the performance had perhaps originally intended. What Vathorindal told him was this. At the hatching of every dragon, a name was given by the elder who cracked the shell, not chosen so much as recognized, drawn out of the qualities already present in the creature emerging, the way a good portrait artist does not invent a face, but finds what is already there and makes it visible. The name was long and layered, because the creature it named was long and layered, and it carried within its syllables a compressed history of lineage, of the particular range of mountains that had shaped the family line, and of the qualities the elders saw and the qualities they hoped for, and the qualities that dragons, across their long centuries, had learned to look for in their young. It was, in every sense that mattered, the truest thing ever said about the dragon who bore it. And among dragons, a name of that kind carried one obligation. Before the bearer died, the name had the road that narrowed. 60 years is a long time to search for a single thing. For a human, 60 years is most of a life, the majority of the available hours, the bulk of the seasons, the greater portion of everything. For a dragon of Vathorindal's age, 60 years was a substantial investment, but not an impossible one, the way a decade of searching might feel to a human who had started young enough and had reason enough to sustain the effort. It was long. It was wearing. But it was not, in the pure mathematics of his remaining lifespan, unreasonable. What made it wearing was not the time, but the diminishing. Every road he followed ended. Every elder who might have heard the name in passing, in some long-ago season of proximity, was dead or unreachable or had lost, in the slow erosion of extreme age, at the precise memories that would have mattered. Every archive he knew of, the carved stone records of the mountain ranges, the deep inscriptions in cave systems that predated most surface settlements, had been checked and cross-referenced with the exhausting patience of a mind that was, among its other qualities, extremely thorough. Every creature with enough years to possibly be carrying the right memory had been found and approached and gently questioned. Nothing held. The roads narrowed one by one, the way possibilities narrow when you are solving a problem honestly. Not by giving up on branches, but by following each one fully to its end and accepting what you find there. Vathorindal had followed every branch. He had accepted every ending. That he had turned back from each dead end and returned to the diminishing map of what remained and looked at it with the clear eyes of a creature that had decided very early in the search that hope and accuracy were not the same thing, and that confusing them would help nothing. And then, at the end of 60 years of narrowing, one road remained. It was not a road he had expected. It was not an elder or what the silence held. The dragon finished speaking, and the square held its breath. Not literally. The children still shifted occasionally in their semicircle, and somewhere behind the inn door someone coughed and was immediately and furiously shushed. But in the way that spaces hold their breath when something significant has just been said, and the air has not yet decided what to do with it. The old language settled into silence, the way sediment settles in still water, slowly, finding its level, becoming part of the ground rather than something suspended above it. Corwin did not fill the silence immediately. This was, for those watching who knew him even slightly, entirely characteristic. He had never been a man who rushed to occupy quiet spaces with sound. Then he sat with the silence the way he sat with everything, fully present in it, not managing it from a distance, not performing thoughtfulness, but actually engaged in it, somewhere behind his eyes, in the place where the real work of a person happens, and where no one else can follow. The sun moved. It moved the way it moves when you are not watching it, imperceptibly in any given moment, undeniably across the accumulation of moments, the shadows in the square shifting their angles with the slow certainty of something that has been doing this for longer than anything watching it, and will continue long after. The amber light that had been falling across the cobblestones at a midday angle had deepened and lengthened into the particular gold of late afternoon, not the kind of light that makes even ordinary things look briefly like they are being seen for the last time. The tea beside him had been cold for hours. He looked at it once, briefly, with the expression of a man noticing something he had meant to attend to and had genuinely forgotten, and then he looked back at Vathorindal, and whatever he had been working through in the silence behind his eyes had apparently reached its conclusion. Because 17 and snowbound. There is a particular clarity that comes with believing you are about to die, not the panicked clarity of sudden danger, the sharp animal focus that narrows everything to the immediate and the physical and the single available action. A different kind. The clarity that arrives when the danger is slow and certain and there is nothing left to do about it, when the body has accepted the situation before the mind has finished arguing with it, when the available actions have been exhausted, and what remains is simply the fact of the moment and whatever a person chooses to do with it. Corwin had been 17 years old and alone and injured in a cave at high altitude in the middle of a storm that showed no interest in ending, and he had reached that clarity sometime in the second day, and he had done the practical things first. He was, even at 17, fundamentally practical. It was the bedrock of him, the thing that had been there before anything else was built on top of it. He had made what shelter he could. He had managed the injury as best he was able with what he had. He had rationed carefully and conserved heat and done every reasonable thing that a person does when survival is still a project worth undertaking. And then the practical things had run out, and the storm had continued, and the cave had offered him nothing but time and stone walls, and the choice of what to do with both. He had read the walls. I was 17, he said now, sitting cross-legged on the cobblestones of Ashenvale with the long afternoon light falling across him and 44 years of living between himself and that cave. And I thought I was dying, and your name was carved into the wall. He said it simply, without drama, without the retrospective weight that people sometimes apply to formative moments, gilding them into something more composed than they actually were. He said it the way it had been, a young man, a cave, a wall covered in oil. The witnessing. He unfolded himself from the cobblestones slowly. 61 years old, and the stone had been unforgiving in the way that stone is always unforgiving, indifferent to the needs of the bodies that rest against it, offering nothing in the way of accommodation or apology. His knees registered their objection in the clear and specific language of joints that have been asked to hold a position longer than they considered reasonable. He did not hurry through the standing. He did not perform ease he did not have. He simply rose at the pace that rising required and arrived at vertical with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a man who has made a complete peace with the gap between the body he had at 20 and the body he had now. He straightened his apron. An unconscious gesture. The same small preparation he made at his workbench before beginning something that required his full attention. The gesture of a craftsman settling into his hands before asking them to do something that mattered. He faced Vethorindal. The dragon's head was still resting on the cobblestones, those amber eyes open now to their fullest, not with the alertness of vigilance, but with the particular wide openness of a creature that has decided to receive what is coming without reservation, without the protective half-closure that keeps part of yourself withheld from the moment. Completely present, completely available to whatever the next few minutes would contain. Corwin looked into those eyes for a moment without speaking. He was not gathering himself. He did not need to. He was not rehearsing. There was nothing to rehearse. He was doing what he always did before beginning a piece of work that deserved his best attention. He was simply arriving fully in the moment, setting down every other thing, becoming entirely present in the way that genuine craft requires and that cannot be faked or shortcut or performed convincingly enough to produce the real result. Then H, you are known. The silence that followed was not empty. That was the thing about it. The thing that every person present would carry with them for the rest of their lives and find themselves returning to in quiet moments, in the space between sleeping and waking, in the particular stillness of very early mornings before the day had fully committed to itself. It was not the silence of absence. It was not the silence of a held breath or a suspended moment or something waiting to resolve into whatever came next. It was a silence with weight and texture and presence, the kind that arrives not when everything has stopped, but when everything has completed, when the last note of a piece of music finds its final chord, and the chord is exactly right, and the room holds it, not because it is afraid to break it, but because it has become, briefly, and the most real thing in the available world. The name was in the air, fully spoken, fully received, fully present in the consciousness of every creature in the square, understood by almost none of them, carried now by all of them, embedded in the afternoon of a Tuesday in Ashenvale in a way that would not be dislodged by time or forgetting because the oldest things always leave the deepest marks, even in the minds least equipped to understand them. Corwin let the silence be what it was for a moment. Then he stepped forward, one step, closing the small remaining distance between himself and the dragon's great lowered head, and he placed his hand against Vetherindal's jaw. The scale beneath his palm was warm, warmer than the air, warmer than stone, carrying the deep internal warmth of something that had been burning quietly for 8 centuries, a fire banked so low now that only the warmth remained, the light long since reduced to something only visible in the amber of those open eyes. He felt the heartbeat there, slow, enormous, working away at its remaining task with the same stubborn, patient commitment it had AP. The light in the workshop. The evening came in quietly, the way evenings do after days that have asked too much of the available light. The square was still. The great shape of Vetherindal lay across the cobblestones with the absolute stillness of something that had set down every remaining obligation and found, in the setting down, a peace so complete it had changed the quality of the air around it. He looked, in the long amber light of the dying afternoon, less like a fallen thing than like a thing that had chosen its place deliberately and with full knowledge. A permanent feature of the landscape, like a boulder left by a glacier, carrying in its stillness the record of the enormous forces that had brought it here. The square had emptied slowly after Corwin walked back to his workshop, and people had drifted out from their doorways and their hiding places with the careful tentativeness of people returning to a familiar room that contains something unfamiliar, checking the air, checking each other's faces, establishing by degrees that the world was still the world, and that what had happened in it today had happened completely and was not still happening. Children had been collected. Overturned baskets had been righted without full attention, hands performing the mechanical restoration of ordinary things, while eyes stayed fixed on the great still shape in the center of everything. The blacksmith was the last to move. He stood now at the edge of the dragon with his cap in both hands, unturning it slowly by the brim in the unconscious circular motion of a man whose hands need occupation, while his mind does work they cannot help with. He was a large man, the blacksmith, broad through the shoulders, accustomed to the particular physical confidence of someone who has spent a life moving heavy things and bending resistant materials to necessary shapes. He looked, standing here, considerably smaller than usual, not diminished exactly, simply correctly scale.